Michael Powell, who died 2 years ago, is now recognised as one of Britain's greatest film directors. His best films were made in collaboration with Hungarian-born scriptwriter Emmerich Pressburger and appeared during and just after the war. 49th Parallel, The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, A Matter of Life and Death, and Black Narcissus. The two men enjoyed extraordinary liberty under the patronage of J. Arthur Rank, who believed creative people should be left to make films their way. But after the war, all that changed. Powell and Pressburger eventually parted company. Powell went on to make Peeping Tom, now regarded as a classic, but which was then considered to have destroyed his career. Powell's struggles are charted in the second volume of his autobiography, $1 Million Movie, published next week. For The Late Show, David Thompson tells Michael Powell's post-war story, which begins with the pivotal film, The Red Shoes.
In 1948, Michael Powell seemed to be at the peak of his career, but the reception given that year to The Red Shoes demonstrated that the world as he'd known it was changing. Powell would recall that transition from hope to disillusionment years later on an Australian television show.
Michael, how did Red Shoes come about?
Well, Arthur Rank asked me and Emmerich Pressburger what we wanted to do next. He said, the sky's the limit. And so we told him that we'd written a script about ballet, and about ballet dancers, and about balletomaniacs. And being a Methodist, he agreed.
What did Sir Arthur Rank think of that film?
He thought he'd lost all his money when he saw it. He left the theatre without saying a word.
The glorious days of artistic freedom under J. Arthur Rank's benevolent eye had come to an end. There was no longer the easy tolerance of ambition that Powell and Pressburger had enjoyed in the past. Unhappy with the new terms offered at Rank, they tried to strike up a relationship with eminent producer Alexander Korda, the man who had once introduced them to each other. Under their new contract, they were to make The Small Back Room, an adaptation of Nigel Bolchin's wartime story, whose hero was a bomb disposal expert with a drink problem.
It was the first time I'd worked so close to Mickey, because you know, I was very much a part of it. And he was a great visual director. He cared about the visual side of pictures, and he knew a lot about them. So he worked very closely with the cameraman. It was an unusual story up to a point, and it was being made in black and white, which was contrary to the mainstream because things were all starting to go in colour, which was right for the subject, I think. And I mean, he had wonderful ideas, really.
Although the film was essentially a sombre drama, Powell could not resist adding an expressionist nightmare sequence.
I didn't care for the big whiskey bottle sequence. And I always remember, actually, Cyril Cusack doing a scene which was terribly moving when he more or less turns away from camera. And I thought, you know, this is so much more moving than seeing a man sort of tackle a bottle of, a large bottle of whiskey.
Anything else, sir?
Yes. Is there anything wrong with you? I understand you're having a certain amount of trouble at home.
Yeah, yes, sir.
You wife's not happy?
That's right, sir.
Anything I can do?
No, I don't think so. Thank you, sir.
You sure?
Well, quite sure, sir. Well, unless,
Unless what?
well, if you wouldn't mind, sir, if I could get away a few minutes early sometimes. She's all on her own, you see, sir. And if I could get away a bit early.
Yes, of course. I'll tell Sergeant Major Rose. Today?
No, sir. No, not on a Wednesday, sir.
He was a very smiling director, so it was a very good introduction to our work together. Gradually, it seeped its way through that he could be perhaps verging on the sadistic from time to time. I think he was ruthless, but only when necessary. I would say that occasionally he became a little bit impatient, but on the other hand, there was an interminable patience there for getting things right.
He didn't suffer fools lightly, and if you took dislikes to people, I mean, I think you might as well sort of go out and throw yourself off the roof of a building, because he was remorseless. He had piercing blue eyes. He hardly ever winked. When he stared at you, he was quite frightening. You would go for months and not hear a word from him. And then out of the blue, he would ring you. You always knew it was Mickey because you picked up the phone and there was nothing. You just waited and waited. You didn't say, hello, hello, who is it? Because you knew he wanted you to do that for some strange reason. I don't know why. And eventually, of course, I always did. And then he used to say, oh, Mickey here.
Christopher Challis was just one of a loyal group of technicians who answered Powell's call to work for the Archers on a regular basis. Under Corder, against their better judgment, the team were obliged to do a remake of the Scarlet Pimpernel story, followed by an adaptation of Mary Webb's novel Gone to Earth. But at least the Shropshire settings allowed Powell to express his deep love of the British countryside.
He rang me up and said, we're going to go and look for the locations. Can you come? And I said, yes, sure. And he said, right, well, we're probably going to be away 3 weeks and we're going to walk. Most locations are picked from the back of a limousine, really, a heated limousine. But no, we took rucksacks and we wandered around together, and he loved walking. He did a lot of it. We found marvellous locations, but it made great problems because the equipment in those days was just terrific. I mean, we would carry everything and drag wind machines, and to him it was a challenge. It was a great adventure.
If Powell loved rural Britain, he also loved the south of France, and he inherited a hotel on the south coast from his father. Usually managed by Powell's wife Frankie, it became a regular meeting point for the stars of the British cinema. One familiar guest was the conductor Sir Thomas Beecham, who proposed that Powell and Pressburger make a film of Offenbach's opera The Tales of Hoffmann for Corder. Beecham offered to give a private performance of the entire score for them in preparation for the film.
He played the score right through and sang most of the parts. And I mean, he couldn't sing at all either soprano or bass, but he sang, or sections of it as he played, and he also gave his observations and comments and on the script and on everything else about how he thought things should be done. And it was absolutely extraordinary, and I mean very, very amusing, because he was quite a witty old gentleman. They'd always wanted to film an opera, but they wanted to do it in a different way. They didn't want to just have a photograph of a stage production. And Hein, by that time, Hein Heckroth had come into the fold, and he, of course, was a stage designer with an operatic background. And he really thought in terms of stage and opera and not in terms of film. And Mickey, with all the complications of doing special effects and things in colour in those days, optically, he said, why don't we go back to the early days of filmmaking and do it all in the camera? And, well, to cut it short, that's virtually what we did.
Yeah, no. We were always talking about Powell and Pressburger films on the aspect of it, of what we call now sort of experimentation. And that is using techniques or being bold in certain use of film form, totally within a commercial film context. That is, films as narrative made for the theatrical experience. And here, for example, you look at this cut. He inserts flashes, very different from supering in the traditional way, dissolving a figure in. I think you could see the use of certain techniques which later were to be used in the New Wave films in France and Italy. Again, he does an interesting thing here with these quick cuts of these flashes when he's changing the wax into diamonds here. That's actually literally just a very simple jump cut, but it works. Today they do it's not acceptable, but it works here. It works here. And I was always fascinated by so many different techniques: jump cuts and time cuts and fast action, speeding up the action, slowing down the action. The narrative is in a new construction. The narrative is done through choreography of the people, the dancers really. They seem to be walking and moving normally, and yet they're dancing. So the drama comes through that, and it comes through the camera movement. And that's why I'm such an admirer of Tales of Hoffmann, because it takes that concept of the composed film that Michael always talked about and pushes it to its nth degree. I mean, sometimes not entirely successful, but most of the times for me, very successful.
Powell's experimentation was not completely to his producer's pleasure. In particular, a spoken epilogue had been added featuring the actress Pamela Brown, painted in gold, portraying Hoffmann's muse.
Corder didn't like this scene where the muse was talking, and he said, cut it out. By this time, Mickey, the audience will be gone. They won't want to see it. And they had a terrible row about this. And Mickey was terribly hurt and very upset, and he was rude to Corder. There were only the three of us there. And Corder said, very angry, and he said, I will see to it that you do not make another film in this country. You've gone too far, Mickey. And walked off out.
When the people who finance you have opinions about films, this is the beginning of the end.
When they left, Korda, they did not know how to raise money. Someone like Scorsese has learned how to raise money from the time he was 18 years old. He's gone in and battled and been involved in doing that and has learned how to do it and how to bring the studios along, make them understand your project if you can, fight to preserve it if they try and hurt it. But he realizes he needs them and they need him. Michael had never learned how to do that, so it was too late for him and Emmerich to learn. They tried to raise money, but they were disastrous at it. I mean, it was just, Michael would insult people and walk out of the room, and you can't do that.
I don't know what you can learn from successes, but you can learn from other people talking about failures. And failures or near misses, you know, almost good movies, or failures at certain meetings, you know, what they say now in Hollywood, that wasn't a good conversation. You know, it wasn't a good conversation. I think it's remarkable to see how it affected his career. Rank gave them such a special place to these wonderful films. And after the war, that changed.
Powell and Pressburger briefly returned to Rank in 1955 to make The Battle of the River Plate. It was a straightforward war film based on real events.
It was the night of nights in the West End, the Queen's attendance at the Royal Film Performance. Thousands outside the theatre saw the stars arrive. Victor Mature earned a cheer, but perhaps it was Marilyn Monroe with dramatist husband Arthur Miller who excited onlookers most. John Gregson is one of the stars in the film the Queen was to see. Lovely Brigitte Bardot. Admirals Parry and Woodhouse were among naval representatives. Michael Powell with wife. He produced and directed with, of course, Emmerich Pressburger. Her Majesty was received by Mr. Reginald Bromhead.
It was a pretty British affair. No concessions. And then we did another one based on a real kidnapping of a German general in Crete, ill-met by moonlight. And I couldn't do anything with it. It was, you know, I just couldn't bring anything interesting to it. I didn't like being tied down to the facts.
Unable to find backing for their projects, Pressburger and Powell went their separate ways in 1957. Looking for new writers, Powell was recommended one Leo Marx by a fellow producer.
He said there's a wonderful code breaker. He'd been a code breaker in the war, Leo Marx. He said, he's got a marvelous mind. He said, you two ought to get together. You're both funny sort of bastards. And you'll probably get on.
Mr. Powell, how would you like to make a film about a man who kills the women he photographs?
I said, yes, I would. That's exactly right.
It'll be £2.
I read Peeping Tom to him because I didn't trust him to read it for himself. And whilst reading it to him, that man was sitting there and he was photographing it. And at the end of one particularly important sequence, I said, "Is that all right, Mr. Powell?" He said, "Don't interrupt me, I'm filming it." And he was.
The peeping Tom of the title was Mark, played by Carl Böhm. A studio camera assistant by profession, he also takes pornographic photographs.
Can you fix it so the bruises don't show? Well, can you?
I think so, Minnie.
Be quick about it, Sonny. I'm melting.
The recreation of a lurid style, of a certain aspect of life, those, I guess, that kind of a down feeling about these types of magazines and these photos, and the attention to detail there is kind of shocking and truthful. See, you know, it's truthful. That was the big difference. It just wasn't done for shock effect, and it wasn't done for sex. It was really very moving and disturbing at the same time.
Mark, what a beautiful little boy. Who is he?
Me?
Of course it is. Then who took this film?
My father.
What a wonderful idea. You'll be able to show it to your own children. Oh, you must have had a bad dream. What was the light in your eye? Camera, I suppose.
In the role of the young Mark, Powell cast one of his own sons, Columba.
He'd explain what he was trying to get at, and if he wanted a certain emotion, like crying, you know, he'd kind of say, well, do you remember how, you know, when you've had do you remember how you reacted when you had a nightmare? How, that kind of thing. So, and I'd do that, and he'd act for me. I remember him showing movies to me and my friends from a very early age, so we were used to movies, so it was nothing sort of extraordinary. People always pick up on Peeping Tom because some of it, the home movie stuff, just got him in it and myself, and it's in his garden, and they use his camera bag, and the blind woman has my mum's jacket, and there's little things like the photographer, Carl Böhm, has his jacket. In fact, he dressed very like Dad used to dress on the set. So there's a lot of stuff people think a bit odd, but actually it's just, he's just using, I don't know what the budget was, he's just using what was around, and it gives it a sort of, a little quirkiness.
The film was full of compassion, but it was full of compassion for a diabolical murderer. But then for me, he wasn't a diabolical murderer. He was a cameraman.
He loved making it, and one of the saddest experiences for him was that they were having such a wonderful time making it. He loved working with that cameraman. They were coming up with all kinds of wonderful ideas, and he and Carl Böhm went to the opening night thinking that there was going to be a wonderful reaction, and people just came out looking at them as if they were porno filmmakers or something. I mean, horrified, and it was a devastating experience for Carl Böhm particularly, who still, whenever I see him, he still talks about it. He can't quite understand what happened.
The critics loathed Peeping Tom, and Powell's career in Britain was effectively over.
I hadn't heard from him for, I would think, 2 years, and the phone rang and I picked it up. Oh, Mickey. I said, hello, Mickey, how are you? All right, would you like to come to Australia? So I said, well, I don't really know. When? He said, tomorrow. Just like that. So I said, well, I can't, I'm afraid. I mean, oh, never mind. He said, never mind. I thought you might like to come. And that was the conversation.
After lengthy negotiations, Powell arrived in Australia in 1966 to make a popular comedy based on the best-selling novel, They're a Weird Mob. A huge success in its own country, this was followed by another Australian production, Age of Consent. Starring James Mason as an artist and a young Helen Mirren as his muse, it was to be Powell's last feature film.
When James said to me, let's do another film together, I said, let's do The Tempest.
Powell's script was a highly elaborate and visual adaptation of Shakespeare's play. After completing it, he took a copy of the script with him to James Mason's Swiss home and proceeded to read it out to him.
My Lord Duke, see how the pallid moon has mountains, valleys, seas, and waterways. This is a world like ours. This is no lamp hung in the sky to inspire the sighs of lovers. This is a world that turns around the sun, the sole and fixed center of our universe as our world turns. So writes the wise Copernicus here in this book, De Revolutionibus Oribum Celestium. This dusty handful, this little earth of ours, is but a speck of the universe. Why then should we yield to Rome's infallibility, the right to burn, to sanctify, to sty men's minds in ignorance and darkness, to deny the natural laws with papal bulls? These lenses set men free.
At this point, James interrupted and said, "That scene with Galileo, is it Shakespeare?" I said, "No, it's Powell," and read on.
James Mason said to me, "Well, would you like to have a go at our project?" I said, "What project?" He said to me, "I own a project which is Tempest, and I have a script, I have one here, and director will be Michael Powell." And I asked, "Michael Powell of the Red Shoes?" He said to me, "Yes." "Yes, please." I said, "But what can I do?" In a short time, my people in Greece agreed to put all the money needed, as long as we can secure the money which we need for post-production and the English actors in England. And I really thought, as a first effort, I couldn't see how I could fail. Then I went to Arthur Rank to have a chat about the script. I went to the reception, and they said, "Yes, just a moment." So from the second floor, a little man came down from the stairs, who was about 5 feet no more, with a big bow, big and high his face, in black suit, and he stood at attention in front of me and said to me,
"Mr. Constantine, J. Arthur Rank have decided not to employ Mr. Michael Powell anymore."
Then he just vanished, the same way he appeared. He turned and climbed up, and that's it. I stopped there dizzy. I didn't know what to say. So I went back to my office, and I told Michael about, in a polite way, what happened, and he really got upset and angry. But he knew how to control his temper. But that day, he got up and kicked the dustbin.
He wanted to do The Tempest because it was about magic, and he felt he was a magician and as a filmmaker. And one of the reasons he preferred A Matter of Life and Death to Colonel Blimp was because he felt he was really almost like a god playing with film magic there. And that's why that film meant a great deal to him personally. So The Tempest had those same elements. And it really, really broke his heart when it never got. Still, right to the end, it was a terrible tragedy for him.
By the early 1970s, Powell's career was in a state of collapse. He was living apart from his wife Frankie, and money was scarce. His closest relationship through this period was with the actress Pamela Brown.
Both of their careers were failing, I would think, partially because of her health. They had a tremendous spiritual bond and a great similar idea of what life should be. They loved literature. They liked going for walks in the country. They liked driving long distances, and particularly they loved the country. So as both of them became poorer and poorer, they were able to buy this little cottage in Gloucestershire, which became a sort of secret haven. Michael wrote and wrote and wrote there, and he and Pamela were intensely happy there for, unfortunately, not a long enough time because her health was already failing, and in fact she then died there at sort of the low ebb of Michael's terrible period of obscurity.
He would never let on. I mean, people didn't know during the bad times. I mean, even his closest friends because he'd be dressed up to the nines, immaculately dressed, and he probably hadn't eaten or something. You would never know. He was just like that.
He almost went to jail for non-payment of the rates, so I don't think it could have been a worse time. And just at that moment, Martin Scorsese arrived on the horizon.
I was very excited, and I could not express enough what meeting him meant to myself and to a lot of other people in America who really enjoyed the pictures. I had just shot Taxi Driver, and I only had 2 major features out, Mean Streets and Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. And I think Mike Kaplan took him to see Alice. I think it was playing at the Curzon Theatre in London. And then I said, oh, but you must see Mean Streets. I told him, if you're going to go and see Alice, but you must see Mean Streets. It's more indicative of what I had planned to do. I felt a lot of Powell Pressburger influence in Mean Streets. And that was the boldness, I think, of editing style and use of music, to let music take over, and the use of slight slow motion. So I got a screening, somehow got a screening from Michael, and he wrote me a letter. And he was, in the letter, he was very praise, great powerful praise. However, he felt that the language was a problem, and he also thought that the use of red was overdone. But actually, I always point out, usually his films where I became aware of the color red, but I'm talking about 3-strip Technicolor. You know, with Eastman color, it's a little different, as we all know. So he felt it was overdone, but he did like it.
In 1980, Powell took a teaching post in America with Scorsese's encouragement.
When I met Scorsese, and we were editing Raging Bull, Michael was at that point teaching at Dartmouth University. And he would come in every once in a while for dinner, and Marty would always say, would I like to join? And of course, the first time I ever met him, I'm afraid I fell madly in love with him immediately, because he was so full of life. I've never met anyone who smacked you in the face the way Michael did. He was so vivid and full of humor and wit, and a formidable figure in many ways, visually, extremely interestingly dressed always.
Morning, Colonel. Anything for me?
Another Powell fan, Francis Coppola, invited the senior director to join him at his Zoetrope Studios in 1981.
I don't know, I've always been a sucker for film studios. You know, when I first came out here and found myself in Zoetrope Studios, it was absolutely wonderful to me. I felt as if I'd come home again.
I'm afraid it was probably already over, Zoetrope. Francis was overextended, and his great enthusiasm had run out of money already. And so I don't think there was very much for Michael to do, but he loved being there. He loved being around filmmakers, asked his opinion, which was usually pretty blunt. But he was living in rather sort of penurious surroundings. He had a little funny flat with no telephone, no television set, and of course he had no car. To live in Los Angeles without a car is unheard of. And Michael would walk to places or take the bus. And because he had no phone, he would telephone me from the phone booth outside of the supermarket next to where he lived. And he would call collect, of course. And it became a big joke between us for years about that.
Why do fools fall in love? Why do birds sing so gay? In love with nowhere to play to play. Why do they fall in love? Why does the rain fall from up above? Why do fools fall in love? Why do they fall in love?
I don't get it.
Hey, Martin.
Ah, Michael. How are you, sir?
Happy birthday! Happy birthday!
Zoe.
What's going on here?
Nothing. Just act natural.
He's refusing to be cinema birthday.
Good.
And you're working and...
Oh yeah, we'll continue working. We don't, no difference to us here.
But you're coming to them.
Oh yes.
Oddly enough, for two directors who have done so much for each other and meant so much to each other for 10 years, you would think that it would be an easy relationship, but it wasn't an easy one at all. Marty always said to me, I wish I could just sit and just talk with Michael. And I always said to him, but you can. And he said, no, I can't. I'm too much in awe of him. And Michael, on his part, was not an easy social person. He was not much of a talker. He was a dreamer and a thinker, and he, in social situations, loved to be around other people talking. But you would look at him and you would see that he was drifting off thinking about his book or something.
Should we believe everything he says in his books?
No, I don't think so.
Why is that?
Well, I think he had a vivid imagination, and I think all creative people, particularly when they get old, I mean, like me, the memories start to fail, and you can't challenge what somebody has said all that time ago with absolute certainty because you can't really remember yourself. But no, I think a lot of it was a figment of imagination. But I mean, basically, I think it's true, except I think sort of subconsciously things that he would have liked to happen, he makes happen.
Well, I thought he portrayed some events about me with a slight fantasy. I don't remember ever pulling a gun on him or being stark naked at the time, because I think if I'd wanted to pull a gun on somebody, I wouldn't bother to have undressed. I'd have just pulled the gun. But that is complete fantasy. That didn't happen. I don't know about other people's lives, so what he says about them. I know his son seems to say his father was a fantasist most of the time.
Life was virtually like a movie, and he was editing it in his head. And so you were just part of the movie. You know, even when he was dying, his mind was shooting ahead. I mean, he was creating. And he'd have us in hysterics. And there was this guy being eaten away by cancer. And this poor little body, you know, you could see, you know, being sort of starved. And yet his brain was ticking over at us at an amazing speed.
The fact that he never became bitter himself, I think, the fact that he never let what had happened to him destroy him, taught me a great deal about how to approach life, and his great love for things. He taught me so much about that. He opened up so much to me. I think watching him constantly learn and grow was startling for a man of his age. I remember we used to go to films, and he would give it 10 minutes, and that was it. If he felt it was worthwhile staying, he would stay. But it was only 10 minutes, and if he did stay the full time, he would sometimes come out of it and say, I didn't learn one thing from that filmmaker. He would be furious because he felt that was the obligation of the director, to startle and come up with something new. But above all, he always said to me, whatever you do, just don't be boring. This was one of his great lessons for me.